Imagine walking into a dusty storefront in Lower Manhattan in the fall of 1945, laying down a $10 bill, and walking out carrying a piece of technology so advanced that just months earlier it had been classified secret by the United States government. No paperwork, no security clearance, no questions asked. You could hold it in your hands, take it home, and turn it on. This actually happened. Not to one person, but to hundreds of thousands of Americans, and it triggered something nobody in Washington saw coming. A radio revolution built entirely out of the wreckage of war. For years, radar technology had been one of the most tightly guarded secrets on Earth, developed in frantic secrecy, protected by armed guards, whispered about only in code. It helped win the Battle of Britain. It hunted German U-boats across the freezing Atlantic. It guided bombers through pitch-black skies over Japan. And then, almost overnight, it was being sold out of cardboard boxes for the price of a movie ticket and a sandwich. How does the most advanced electronic warfare technology on the planet end up in a bargain bin? And why did that single decision quietly reshape American technology, education, and even outer space exploration for the next 50 years? Stick with me, because this story starts with a government warehouse problem and ends with a teenager in Ohio talking to a stranger in Australia using a machine built from a shot-down bomber. To understand how any of this happened, you have to understand just how enormous the American war machine had become by 1945. The United States wasn't just building rifles and tanks, it was building an electronic empire. Factories in Chicago, in Massachusetts, in California were turning out radar sets, radio transmitters, navigation beacons, and communication gear at a pace that had never existed in human history. Companies like Western Electric, RCA, and Hallicrafters weren't just manufacturers anymore. They were the backbone of an invisible battlefield, one fought not with bullets, but with electromagnetic waves. Every bomber needed a radio. Every fighter needed a command set. Every ship needed radar. Every outpost needed a way to talk to headquarters across oceans of static and distance. By the middle of the war, the United States government had contracted for millions of individual radio and radar units, an industrial effort so massive it rivaled the production of aircraft and ammunition combined. This was a war won as much in laboratories as it was on beaches, and the men who built these machines knew they were creating something the public had barely begun to imagine. Engineers at MIT's radiation laboratory were pushing microwave technology further than anyone thought possible, developing magnetrons and klystrons capable of generating power at frequencies once considered pure fantasy. These weren't hobbyist gadgets. These were the beating heart of Allied victory. And soon, all of it would need somewhere to go. Then, in the span of a few months, the war simply stopped. Germany surrendered in May. Japan surrendered in August. And across the country, something strange began happening in factories that had been running 24 hours a day for years. The machines went quiet. Assembly lines that had built bombers and battleship radar sets suddenly had nothing left to build. Contracts worth billions of dollars were cancelled almost instantly. Soldiers began pouring home by the millions, discharged, decommissioned, desperate to return to ordinary life. But behind them, they left something staggering. Warehouses, airfields, depots scattered across the country and around the world, stacked floor to ceiling with radios, radar units, spare parts, vacuum tubes, transformers, and cable, worth billions of dollars at wartime prices. The government now faced an almost impossible question. What do you do with an entire arsenal of electronic technology that no one needs anymore? Technology so advanced that some of it had been top secret only weeks before. You couldn't just throw it away. You couldn't keep guarding it forever. And storing it was costing taxpayers a fortune every single day it sat untouched. Something had to give. And fast. Nobody in Washington had a plan for what came next. The agency handed this impossible task was called the War Assets Administration, created specifically to liquidate the mountain of surplus military property left behind by the war. And when historians talk about the scale of this challenge, they aren't exaggerating. We're talking about aircraft parts, jeeps, tents, uniforms, tools, and buried somewhere inside all of it, an almost unimaginable quantity of radio and radar equipment. Some of it had never even been used, still sealed in factory packaging, shipped out for a war that ended before it arrived. Government officials debated fiercely over what to do. Some wanted strict military control maintained indefinitely, worried that releasing radar technology to the public could leak sensitive knowledge to rival nations. Others argued the opposite, that the fastest and cheapest solution was simply to sell it, dump it onto the open market, let private citizens and businesses absorb what the military no longer needed. There were congressional hearings, there were arguments about national security, there were arguments about economic recovery, about jobs, about how quickly America could pivot from a wartime economy back to a peacetime one. In the end, practicality won. Recycling and shredding this equipment would have taken years and cost enormous sums of money the country simply didn't want to spend after 4 years of war spending. Selling it, on the other hand, could generate revenue, clear warehouse space almost overnight, and be framed as a gift to the American public, a reward for years of sacrifice and rationing. The decision was made almost by necessity rather than vision, and it would change electronics history forever. And so it began. Across the country, in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, surplus stores started opening their doors, piled high with military radio and radar equipment, sold for a fraction of its original military cost. In Manhattan, an entire stretch of Cortlandt Street became legendary among electronics enthusiasts, a chaotic strip of storefronts crammed with command radio sets, aircraft transceivers, and mysterious black boxes still stamped with military inventory numbers. It became known simply as Radio Row, a place where you could walk in as a curious teenager and walk out with equipment that had, only recently, been flying over Berlin or the Pacific. Out in Ohio, dealers began advertising through mail-order catalogs, shipping surplus command sets and receivers to farm towns and small cities where nothing like this had ever been available before. Suddenly, aircraft radio command sets, originally designed to coordinate fighter squadrons, were being repurposed by teenagers in basements. $10, sometimes less, could buy you a receiver capable of pulling in signals from thousands of miles away. Technology that had cost the government dozens of times that amount to produce just a few years earlier. It wasn't just receivers, transmitters, antenna components, precision tuning capacitors, and vacuum tubes flooded the market too, sold in bulk, sold by weight, sold in crates nobody had even bothered to fully inventory. But that wasn't the strangest part. The true jackpot, the equipment that quietly changed everything, was radar. Microwave radar components, the same magnetrons and waveguide assemblies developed under wartime secrecy, began appearing in surplus catalogs, often stripped from decommissioned aircraft and ships. Most buyers had no idea what they were actually holding. To the untrained eye, it looked like tangled metal and glass, strange tubes with cryptic military designations. But to a growing community of curious tinkerers, engineers, and amateur radio operators, these parts represented something extraordinary. Access to microwave frequency technology that, until recently, had been locked behind military clearance and classified research labs. For the first time in history, ordinary citizens could experiment with the same electromagnetic frontier that had helped win the war. What happened next surprised even the surplus dealers themselves. Amateur radio, known to enthusiasts as ham radio, had existed since the early 20th century, but during the war, the government had shut it down almost completely, banning civilian transmissions to prevent any interference with military communications, or worse, unintentional signals reaching enemy forces. For 4 long years, thousands of licensed operators sat silent, their equipment gathering dust, forbidden from making contact with the outside world. When the ban lifted after the war ended, that pent-up demand exploded outward all at once, and it collided directly with the flood of cheap surplus electronics now filling storefronts across the country. Suddenly, a hobby that had once required expensive, hard-to-source components was wide open to anyone willing to hunt through a surplus bin. A struggling factory worker, a curious schoolteacher, a returning veteran with nothing but a government paycheck and some free time, all of them could now afford to build a functioning radio station. Membership in amateur radio organizations surged. New licenses were issued at a pace the pre-war hobby had never experienced. Radio clubs sprang up in small towns that had never had one before, meeting in church basements and school gymnasiums, trading tips on how to modify surplus command sets for civilian frequencies. What began as a government inventory problem had accidentally created the largest wave of amateur electronics enthusiasts America had ever seen. And the ripple effects went far beyond hobbyists talking to each other across state lines. This surplus boom quietly built the foundation for entire companies and even entire industries. Businesses that had started as small surplus resellers grew rapidly, some evolving into major electronics distributors that would supply parts to engineers for decades. Mail-order catalogs stuffed with military surplus parts became required reading for a new generation of self-taught electronics tinkerers, many of whom had no formal engineering education at all, just curiosity, a soldering iron, and a stack of cheap components pulled from a decommissioned bomber. Returning veterans, funded by the newly created GI Bill, poured into electrical engineering programs at universities across the country, many of them having gotten their very first hands-on experience not in a classroom, but hunched over a workbench with surplus radar parts spread out in front of them. Professors began noticing something remarkable. Students who had never touched formal coursework already understood waveguides, frequency modulation, and vacuum tube circuitry, self-taught through nothing more than curiosity and a $10 box of Army surplus. The post-war electronics workforce that would go on to build television, early computing, and eventually the technology behind space exploration was, in no small part, forged in surplus bins. But there were stranger stories buried in this history too, the kind most people have never heard. Some surplus radar units, still technically capable of detecting aircraft, ended up in the hands of civilians who used them for purposes the military never intended, tracking weather patterns, monitoring local air traffic out of pure curiosity, even experimenting with early forms of long-distance signal bouncing off the moon, a technique that decades later would help lay the groundwork for satellite communication research. Certain surplus dealers, unaware of what they were actually selling, moved crates of components that were still technically restricted under wartime secrecy classifications, creating brief but real headaches for government officials who discovered sensitive hardware circulating in civilian hands. There were rumors, some substantiated, of amateur operators managing to bounce radio signals off the ionosphere using modified surplus transmitters, making contact with operators on the other side of the planet using equipment that had cost less than a week's grocery bill. Universities and even some early television stations quietly purchased surplus components to save money during equipment shortages, repurposing military hardware into civilian broadcast infrastructure. Some of the very engineers who tinkered with this surplus equipment as teenagers would go on, just over a decade later, to work on the earliest American satellite and space tracking programs, using radar and communication principles they first encountered not in a classroom, but in a cardboard box marked Army surplus. Almost none of this was planned. All of it grew out of a government simply trying to clear out its warehouses. Looking back from today, it's almost impossible to overstate how much this surplus boom shaped modern electronics culture. The amateur radio hobby that exploded in the years following the war didn't just survive, it became a permanent institution. one that still exists today, connecting operators across the globe using technology that traces its lineage directly back to those chaotic surplus stores. Companies born or expanded during this era went on to supply components for decades of American electronics manufacturing, from early television sets to computing hardware. The self-taught engineering culture created by tinkerers hunched over surplus radar parts helped seed a generation of innovators who didn't wait for formal permission or expensive equipment to start learning. They simply took apart what the war had left behind and figured out how it worked. Today, surviving pieces of this surplus era, old command sets, army radios, and salvaged radar components are treasured by collectors and museums, tangible artifacts of a strange and largely forgotten moment when the most advanced technology of a world war ended up in the hands of ordinary people for the price of pocket change. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important revolutions in technology don't come from grand strategic plans. They come from what's left over when the smoke clears and someone has to figure out what to do with it all. So the next time you hear a story about a garage inventor or a self-taught engineer who changed the world, remember this. Somewhere in America's past, there's a good chance it started the exact same way, with a curious kid, a soldering iron, and a mysterious black box marked with a military stencil, bought for $10 from a surplus store that had no idea what it was really selling. If this hidden chapter of history surprised you, imagine what else has been buried and forgotten. If you enjoyed uncovering this untold story, make sure you like this video and subscribe, because there's another forgotten piece of history waiting, and you won't want to miss where we go next.